Okay. Well, we're 1 minute past, so I will get started. Thank you so much for joining us today to launch the Navigating Climate Change Scenarios for Australia's Tertiary Education Sector report. It's a pleasure to have you here with us, joining us for this online launch today. So to begin with, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we all respectively meet from today. So we have people joining from all over Australia and further abroad, but we would like to respectively pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. As always, we do invite you to let us know where you are joining from in the chat. So if you want to say hello and let us know from which country you're joining, I myself am on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. So thank you so much for joining us for this session today. My name is Rhiannon Boyd. If you haven't met me before, I'm the CEO of ACTS, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome the co-chairs for the group that has led and developed this initiative. So we have the amazing Clare de Castella from Australian National University, Carmen Primo Perez from the University of Tasmania, and Aston Howindt from Deakin University. So these amazing three have been doing a massive amount of work over the last few months to coordinate and lead on this initiative. So you'll be hearing from each of them today as we go through and learn about this work, the scenarios that have been developed, and how you can get involved with this initiative now that this report has been published. Before I do pass over to our first speaker, I do want to do an acknowledgement. So this work has been a collaborative effort and has been great leadership from 12 Australian universities. So these universities not only contributed the amazing expertise from their professional and academic staff to develop this report and develop these scenarios, but they also funded this work as well. So I do want to give a massive thank you to all of the institutions that we have: Australian National University, Charles Sturt University, Deakin University, Monash University, Murdoch University, RMIT, Swinburne, the University of Melbourne, Adelaide, University of Western Sydney, Uni of Tasmania, and of course, University of Wollongong. So thank you so much for supporting, leading, and being involved in this initiative. And we look forward to seeing how it's going to continue, because this is really the first step with this project. And by the end of the session today, you'll have a fantastic idea of how you can get involved and engaged in this work. So that's enough from me to get started. I just will make some quick housekeeping notes before we go along with the session. We do encourage questions. So if you do have a question from our speakers or around this work, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. So click on the little Q&A button, you can submit your questions. You can post things in the chat, but there is the potential for questions to get lost and we might not see them. So if you do have a burning question, please do pop it in the Q&A function. And then there is time at the end of the presentation where we'll go through and answer as many of the questions that we have. So I think that's it from me. I will now pass over to Aston, who's going to move into the next part of the presentation.
Thanks, Rhi, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So my job is to tell you a little bit of the background of why we did this and how we went about it before I pass over to Carmen, who will talk through the results of the work. So Rhi, we'll jump on to the next slide. Too quick. So the first question that usually everyone asks me when I talk about the work that I'm doing on this is really, why did you undertake it? And so that's multifaceted, and really we have to acknowledge that in recent times there has been some legal or legislative requirements in Australia, particularly around the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards, the ASRES, that have come into effect. This has been a particular driver for some of our institutions, particularly in Canberra and New South Wales, whereas other institutions across Australia haven't necessarily needed to or haven't been obligated to report. But beyond that, it's all well and good that the government's kind of said, oh, you must report sustainability risks and opportunities. It's really an opportunity for us as a sector to think about how we manage our climate risks and opportunities going forward, and integrating how climate change or thinking about climate change, how it becomes a strategic driver for us as institutions. And that may be through advancing sustainability goals or looking at the broader picture beyond just our own institutions and supporting the long-term outcome for Australia. And really, I'm hesitant to use the term, but future-proof us going forward. But I will say that we are not starting off on this journey without some assistance from cousins across the ditch. And so Ree will jump on the next slide and just acknowledge that New Zealand, our tertiary education colleagues in New Zealand, they're actually a little bit of ahead of the game, when we're comparing to us. So we utilised a lot of their expertise. Particularly, I want to give a big shout out to Andrew Jackson, who is formerly of Victoria University, Wellington, who assisted us as a consultant in developing our scenarios. And that was on the back of the work that he had completed as part of the New Zealand tertiary education sector. And you can see the title, the title slide on the screen there. So I do encourage you, if you do have a few minutes, please go check that out as well. But beyond that, we need to think about, well, what is a scenario? And so we will jump to the next slide. And so scenarios, and this goes back to the origins of this kind of reporting with the Task Force for Climate related Financial Disclosures. It's really a descriptive narrative based on informed imagination. And I really need to stress that these are not intended to be comprehensive descriptions of the future. They're hypothetical constructs, and they are not predictions or forecasts, and we don't consider them to be useful in sensitivity analysis. And a great example that you can see on the screen here is really there's a realm of possible futures. And the tighter you go in terms of the center, you get more probable, but they're not necessarily going to occur in the first instance, and they're not necessarily our preferred futures. And so the idea is to broaden our horizons, broaden our imagination, to really think through the differences in how we will be impacted going forward. And so a great example of this is on the next slide, where I invite you to think about putting yourself in someone's shoes in the 1960s and thinking, well, what's going to happen over the next 65 years? Are we going to have the same number of students that we were having back then, or will we have the same sort of proportion of funding going forward? Now, I think I'm possibly going to create a spoiler here and say it's not necessarily what you're predicting here. So I've put some predictions on there just based on historical trends and thinking, well, it's probably going to remain the same or somewhat similar. But if we jump to the next slide, you can clearly see that it's vastly different to what any rational person might have thought back then. So this gives a really good example of there's no guarantees in future work, and there's no guarantees to outcomes going forward. And that I hope puts you in the frame of mind of trying to understand, well, what we're presenting today is not a prediction of what's going to happen. It is a realm of possible futures, and it's going to help us guide our thinking going forward. So given I've set the scene, we might jump into, well, how did we actually go about it? And there's a beautiful shot of some of our workshop participants. I believe that's in Canberra, helping us out. And so if we go look at some more of the detail, we had about 30 working group members from institutions around the country, and they helped organise approximately 10 workshops across 5 locations. And there was over 100 workshop participants, and those participants came from a variety of expertise. It wasn't just sustainability people. There was people from climate science, finance, risk management, even in facility operations as well. So we wanted the diverse viewpoint to really understand, well, what is going to change over time as we look at these different futures. And I'll talk to you in a little bit about what those different futures are. But then once we got all the great ideas out of the workshops, we then said to Andrew, who helped us out, you have to collate this into a narrative. And so it wasn't our job, and I'm very glad it wasn't, because it was a challenging job. But basically, we came up with these scenarios and then had them sanity checked, so to speak, by some independent experts from Australian institutions. So these were experts in climate risk, climate futures, and came from the likes of ANU and Murdoch, among others as well. And then finally, it was our job as co-chairs, so Carmen, Clare, and myself, to have a final review and just make sure that all the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed. Okay, so beyond that, one of the main challenges, and I'm an engineer as a background, and one of the things that stuck out to me as I was learning engineering at university was one of the primary challenges is to find the question properly. And that was our first task as a working group, was to say, well, what question do we want to answer? And so, as you can see on the screen, it's a very broad question that we came up with, was how could climate change impact Australia's tertiary education sector in 2030s, 60s, and 90s? And we deliberately chose those 3 time periods to have a look at, particularly looking at the longer term as well. We wanted to get a bit of depth to that. But that's really broad. And what do we mean by impact on Australia's tertiary education sector? And so we then defined, well, what are the things that we want to understand when we are talking about futures? We defined 6 key, we call them aspects of what could change in a university. And these include how teaching occurs in universities, what research are we going to undertake, if any, how is it going to impact on our staff and students going forward? And even more fundamentally, what is the role of a university in the Australian economy or the Australian society going forward under these different climate futures? And then finally, the really classic one that I always like to think about, which is how are our operations, how are we going to change how we operate our buildings, our infrastructure, and even non-hard assets going forward. So that being said, we developed a series of axes to help with this. And you can see on the next slide that we define a series of axes, just one axis, it's a 2-dimensional axis. And we defined the horizontal axis based on a variety of they're not extremes, but I'll call them extremes just for this context, 2 extreme temperatures. So one being a 1.5 degree warming compared to pre-industrial levels, and the other being on the right-hand side, a 3.6 degree warming. And the reason why we chose those 2 extremes, as I said, was there was a couple of different reasons. The first being that under the ASRES legislation, one of the scenarios that any company needs to look at is a 1.5 degree world. So that's why we chose the 1.5 degree. And just to acknowledge that there was some debate within the workshop participants and even the working group as to why we're choosing the 1.5 degree, given the kind of, for lack of a better term, climate that we are in, where we are seeing temperatures hitting that, not necessarily breaching that threshold, but we are close to that. And then on the other side, the 3.6, we decided to look at the breadth of impacts. So the legislation to meet the obligations of some of our institutions says above 2.5, but we wanted to go further than that to really understand, well, under a really challenging scenario, what would that look like? And the final thing I'll note about the temperature ranges that we talked about is that these do align to some of the shared socioeconomic pathways that you can see on the screen there. So the first 2 being for the 1.5 degree world, and then this the second highlight, or the 4th one down, is related to the 3.6 degree world there. Now, this was all well and good. It gives us two variables to talk about when we're developing our scenarios, so to speak. But what Andrew did when he was helping us was to think about beyond just the physical temperature or the physical aspects of climate change, and think about the more social aspects. And we defined a second axis that you can see on the next slide, being related to, well, how do governments in Australia approach the change that's going to occur as a result of climate change? And we defined, again, two, I'm going to call them extremes, of how Australian governments focus on meeting the challenges of climate change. So on the one hand, there might be a reactive approach where governments are focused on meeting immediate and medium-term social, environmental, and economic needs. And you can think about them as rapid action or agile, and having short-term plans between 1 and 4 years, and really being reactive in how they approach it. On the other hand, we thought, well, maybe Australian governments might shift their thinking away from a reactive mindset and towards a strategic long-term mindset. And so in those kind of things, we're thinking around 10 to 20-year plans and trying to be resilient to potential events that come through. So combining those two axes, we obviously get the two-dimensional axes that you can see on the screen there. And we then defined on the next slide how those basically combined to give us our 4 scenarios that are in the report that you may have seen this morning. And so I'll go from the top left and circle around. So we've got driven to change, which is a combination of 1.5 degrees warming and a reactive Australian government's focus, compared with a 3.6 degree warming and a reactive, which is juggling with fire. So you can imagine, as we are in a higher temperature and the government's really reactive, we're trying to juggle all the different things that are coming at us as a society. If I then look down the bottom, we've got Together We Survive, which is, again, looking at the higher temperatures, but maybe looking at having a more strategic outset. So we're trying to come together and have a more long-term vision, even in a challenging climate, as we see there. And then finally, Getting Our Act Together. So looking at long-term strategic vision, potentially early on, but getting to a 1.5 degree world. Now, I've talked a lot, and this is where I jokingly said that I'm going to have a wine now, but I won't do that. But I'm going to hand over to Carmen, who's going to take you through some of the next steps, and particularly around the primary impacts that we were looking at. So over to you, Carmen.
Thank you, Aston. Great introduction. And now I'm going to go pretty quickly about how the workshops happened and what we did, so you understand how the narrative was developed. And then I'll talk a bit about the actual report before passing it to Clare to talk about the conclusions and what they are doing at ANU and next steps. So we had 2 workshops per location in the 5 locations. The first workshop was designed to deepen an understanding of the future impacts of climate change and the consequent implications for all the different aspects of the tertiary education sector that we identified as key aspect. So first, we asked participants to consider the broader impacts of climate change. And we started with a few primary impacts, going from the increase in temperature to move to the decarbonization. I won't go through all the details here, but please feel free to ask questions if you have any in the Q&A section. So each group within the workshops was assigned one of these primary impacts to begin with, keeping in mind that it is important to understand how these impacts change under the different pathways. And again, I have a couple of examples there. And Andrew was using a lot of the references that are available right now to understand what the projections were for these primary impacts in Australia and globally. So again, not going to go through all the details, but obviously the more extreme the global warming, obviously the impacts will be much higher. So then we ask participants, if we move to the next slide, to choose one of the primary impacts and start thinking what the secondary impacts derived from that one would be. So that's the column on the left. And again, those are just some examples. For example, for extreme heat, we were thinking, well, the pests will extend the ranges. And then we asked participants to think how all these things will impact in the different key aspects of for the tertiary education sector. So it didn't have to be a table filling all the cells in there, but definitely was a good exercise to stand beyond the typical things that we would think, as Aston was saying, we tend to focus on operations and infrastructure, but all these things will have an impact on all the other aspects as well. Then we obviously acknowledge that climate change is not the only driver of change in the world. It is definitely a very important one. But we asked participants to consider what else would affect the future of the tertiary education sector over the next 75 years. And we came up with a list. I think at the end we selected 8 major ones. Those again are some examples. Artificial intelligence, I think, was the top one for all the workshops. I think it's in everybody's minds right now. And how these additional drivers could change the tertiary education sector. So again, those examples there, I'm not going to go through all of them. And after that, we ask participants to put all these 2 things together. So all the impacts of climate change and the impacts of these other key drivers of change, and start writing a bit of a narrative on how these combined impacts will impact the tertiary education sector. The second workshop, that workshop, participants worked in groups to weave through the ideas from this first workshop and start creating those coherent and plausible features for each of the different scenarios. So we, as Aston said, got a pretty diverse group of people that really helped to create those narratives and put it in a way that that made sense. So if we move to the next slide, a lot of things happened after that. After the workshops, that's when Andrew Jackson did the heavy lifting with the writing. So a big shout out to him for doing all that hard work for us. The working group members then did a first review and made a lot of comments that Andrew addressed again. Then we passed it to the subject matter experts to make sure that those features that we were imagining were plausible. I'm a science fiction fan, so I always think of these features as alternative realities, and in a way it feels like that. But we wanted them to be plausible, possible at the very least, nothing out of there. So we had a pretty final draft after that, and the co-chairs then tried to make sure that it flowed well. We had the information presented in a way that was helpful in different ways. That was another massive work. And then we got a fresh pair of eyes to do proofreading. So someone went through the whole report with fresh eyes and did an additional checking of that. And then we had the formatting. So we have to thank Stacy and Ray for that, to make sure that it looked nice and it was accessible. And you will see the amazing work they did in the final report. So a big thank you to all that participated in the different forums, in the working group workshops, and all the aid that we got from experts and everybody else. Now, if we look at the actual reports, I'm not going to look at all of it, but just so you know how it looks like and where to find things, there are a few sections that would be useful for different people. So if you're interested in understanding just the main highlights and conclusions of all what we did, then the executive summary is a good place to go. It doesn't have a specific information about each of the scenarios, but brings all together as a good summary of the whole thing. Now, if you want to dig a bit deeper, you can go to the scenarios overview section. So in this section, you will have a one-page summary of each scenario, and then you will have a cause and effect pathways diagram to kind of try to explain how we got to the impacts for the tertiary education sector that were defined in each of the scenarios for each time frame that we selected. So you'll have that table there with, again, some key points for each of the key aspects for the tertiary education sector and an icon showing the general trend. If you don't want to go through all of this, there is a section at the end of this scenarios overview part where you have a summary of the possible outcomes with all the scenarios together, so you can see how different they are for each time frame again. And there is also a table with potential outcomes by the numbers if you think about KPIs. And now I'll show you how that looks like in a minute. But finally, if you have the time, I would recommend actually reading these scenarios in detail. And here you can find detailed descriptions of all the cause and effect pathways and the key changes per scenario and time horizon. So there are a few pages of that, but I found it really interesting and eye-opening. So again, if you have time, recommended to go there as well. So I'm going to show a few examples of these summaries, pathways, and the impacts. So this would be for the Getting Our Act Together. So as a reminder, this is the 1.5 warming with the strategic approach of the government. So again, this is not comprehensive. For that, you have to go to the detailed scenarios, but it shows a bit of the highlights of what will happen in that world with, significant increase in climate events and how that will lead to hopefully support for the decarbonization in Australia and what that means in different areas. And from there, in the 2030s, you will have different impacts for all those key aspects in the tertiary education sector. For example, in research, there will be a priority and a focus on STEM, in particular digital technology and health, especially related to climate change, and potentially fewer students and staff following some university mergers. So you could, as I said, go to the summary tables, but you will miss all the cause and effect pathways, and it might not be crystal clear how we got here. So again, I would recommend to read a bit more. The other extreme, if we go to next slide, juggling with fire. So this is the 3.6 global warming and a reactive approach of the government. So again, we start with that 3.6 and what happens there. For example, declining crop yields that leads to global food shortages, and from there, hydroponics response to food shortages, for example. We've always tried, Andrew was very keen to always put an optimistic lens in all the scenarios, including this one. But obviously, this will be a very disruptive alternative reality, which could become a real reality. And as you can see, the impacts for the sector and all those key aspects, the trend is generally down in all of them. So less students, research disconnected from teaching, big impacts on infrastructure, traditional universities no longer exist, few jobs for academics and professional staff at universities, and some serious physical and mental health issues, for example, so a very disruptive future. Again, those were just a couple of examples of a couple of scenarios in specific timeframes, but there are 4 by 3 of these, so a lot to go through. In the next slide, we have that table putting all these scenarios together. This is for the 2090s, but we have one of these for each time horizon that we chosen. And it's I think a quick visual way to see the general trends and how they change in the different scenarios. But again, not going to go into the detail of this, and some of them. These are the same little tables that we have next to the cause and effect pathways, just put all together for an easy comparison between scenarios. And we also have then in the next slide that other table with comparison by the numbers, including the now and then an informed estimate of what these numbers will be like in the different scenarios. And we only have this one for the 2090s because that's where the biggest changes will occur. Obviously, there's not going to be a lot of change in the 1.5 global warming in 2030 because we are pretty much there. So we thought that this would be the most useful, and we didn't go into the 2030s and 60s for this. And I think that's the end of my talk, and I'm happy to pass it to Claire now to talk about the conclusions and next steps.
Thank you, Carmen. So yes, I'm just going to talk about the overall findings at quite a high level. So if we just go to the next slide. Yeah, so the report found that there were 4 key drivers of change that will dictate the landscape for tertiary institutions. The first one is around what actions the world takes to limit greenhouse gas emissions and the resulting temperature change and climate events. The second one is around how the world responds, and that's in terms of climate adaptation and also in terms of geopolitics, economies, demographics, and much more. Thirdly, the level and type of support that Australian governments, and that's both state and federal, provide to the sector. And then fourthly, the impacts of artificial intelligence, which we're only just beginning to see now. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the following challenges were identified in all the scenarios. And firstly, the frequency, severity, and impacts of extreme weather events increase. In juggling with fire and Together We Survive, which was the high emission scenarios, the magnitude of extreme events changes the map of the world by mid-century. So islands are lost and cities and regions abandoned as areas become uninhabitable, leading to mass migration and widespread geopolitical instability on an unprecedented scale. It's pretty sobering. Secondly, there will be significant social and economic changes, as a result of that. And this will be driven by adaptations if we fail to limit temperature rise below 2 degrees, and or via the changes needed to decarbonize society to reach net zero emissions. So that's under all the scenarios. Fiscal pressures are likely to increase, which may lead to ongoing tightening of belts and changing expectations of the sector as society focuses more on survival in the higher emissions scenarios in particular. And obviously, while the cost of extreme events is lower in the low emission scenarios, significant investments are still needed to build carbon neutral societies. But these investments are dwarfed by the economic losses associated with the higher emission scenarios. And next slide, please. So obviously a range of challenges and opportunities for the sector. Some prominent examples of challenges are, it's no surprise to anyone, I think, that infrastructure will need to become more climate resilient to deal with greater climate extremes. Secondly, there's likely to be changes in where and how students learn. So depending on the scenario, there may or may not be more or less face-to-face learning, or potentially all education going online. And that will have a massive impact on student experiences. And then in terms of student numbers, we could see steep declines, for example, due to fiscal pressures, or we could see massive rises through accelerated migration. These challenges are actually accompanied by significant opportunities for the sector. So there's a real role for universities here. They can play critically important roles in reducing the likelihood of reaching a 3.6 degrees world. So they can enhance educational capabilities to ensure that future generations can provide the leadership that Australia needs to deal with these challenges. They can expand, already there's so much research, but expand the research that helps to find the technological and societal, political, environmental solutions, and in the process attracting increasing levels of research funding. And they can connect with communities and local authorities to support adaptation and to respond to extreme weather events. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, no part of the sector will be immune or protected from the impacts of climate change. And as the sector, we need to consider our modus operandi, including how we teach and do research, the kind of experiences we offer for students, how we run our campuses, and how we fund the services that we provide. And then also the sector will play a key role in preparing Australia for the future. So we'll be looked to build Australia's capacity to respond via our teaching, to support the development of new low carbon technologies and other solutions as well, and to provide leadership on societal challenges and policy and the policy and governance models needed to deal with the changing world. Next slide, please. So how can we use these scenarios? What's the next steps for tertiary sector institutions? And I'll reinforce that the scenarios are a dynamic tool to be used by those in governance roles, and then they're not predictions. So firstly, familiarize yourself with the scenarios to broaden your thinking and to consider the possibilities. And then consider climate projections specific to your campus. Obviously, this report was done on a national scale, so every institution is going to have different direct physical climate risks. And then identify and prioritize the risks and opportunities for your institution, and consider what needs to be done to mitigate those risks and capture those opportunities, and who is responsible for doing that. And then integrate that into your planning. And obviously climate adaptation is a journey, so this is going to require continuous refinement and reassessment and alignment with the emerging context as things change. Next slide, please, Bree. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about what we're doing at ANU, and then I'll hand over to one of the other working group members as well. So we're a Commonwealth reporting entity, and that means we actually have mandatory reporting requirements. We have to report on climate risks and opportunities in our 2025 annual report. We looked at a couple of frameworks to help us do that. One of them was a framework called New South Wales Climate Risk Ready, which I believe is being updated. Ultimately, we chose the Commonwealth Risk and Opportunity Management Programme called CROMP, because that was focused not just on risk, but also on opportunities, and also there was a focus on both physical and transition risks. So following this process, we've scoped our assessment of climate risks and opportunities, considering the locations of our campuses and then different dimensions of the university, which very much follows, or the aspects of the university, which very much follows what we identified in this in developing these scenarios. And we're currently working on step 2, 3, and 4 concurrently. And part of that involves considering climate projections for our campuses. We're also using the climate scenarios from this report to help us map our transition risks and opportunities. And we've established an interdisciplinary climate risk working group, which includes academic experts and representatives from all over the university. And we've got a workshop coming up where this group will be prioritising those risks and opportunities. So the scenarios are proving to be a really useful tool for engaging stakeholders and for encouraging consideration of cascading and compound risks to paint a picture of possible futures or plausible futures. And the next step is to embed this updated, more comprehensive climate risk assessment into our enterprise risk management framework. And we're also engaging with decision makers via various sort of governance mechanisms to embed consideration of climate opportunities and risks into the university's strategic planning processes. And then the next step from there is we'll disclose the work we've done in this year and in future annual reports, and then continue to sort of monitor and evaluate and refine. So that's a sort of overview of what we're doing here. I'll hand over now to Siobhan McCarthy, who's going to outline how Murdoch University is planning to use these scenarios. Siobhan, over to you.
Thanks, everyone. Can you see and hear me?
Yes.
Great. So we're in a bit of a different position at Murdoch University. In Western Australia, we're not some of those legislative requirements that are driving this work in other jurisdictions don't apply yet. So what that means is it's giving us a little bit of extra space to review this report, discuss with our stakeholders, and really socialise the importance of climate scenarios work and risk and opportunity assessment as a really powerful tool to support strategic decision making and resource allocation, to create a resilient organisation, but also, as Claire said, to be a leader, position universities really as leaders in the community to support the community to deal with the impacts of climate change, particularly through our education and research. So the next steps for us are really to review and discuss with our stakeholders, and we're lucky at the university to have a number of experts in climate science, but also in policy, and also meet with subject matter experts from across the university to really discuss what the best next steps are for us. But essentially those steps will probably look like localizing the climate scenarios for our specific context in WA, and as a kind of quite unique university on a bush campus with a veterinary school on campus and so on, and a farm, so quite a unique university. And then look at our risks and opportunities and discuss them and discuss ways to incorporate them into our strategic planning and our risk management moving forward. So I also think it's been an amazing opportunity to be a part of this working group. And one of the best things that I think have come out of this report is that connection between the universities and really working together as a sector. And so really looking forward to continuing to work with the working group moving forward and share our learnings. And yeah, so thanks for the opportunity to speak today, and thank you to the chairs who have done, I would say, the lion's share of work, and which is really much appreciated by the rest of the universities and ACTS as well.
Thanks so much for joining us, Siobhan, and a really lovely segue, I think, to we've got one or two slides before we open it up to questions, and some questions have come through the Q&A, so thank you for those. Please do send them through. So what's next? You've heard quite a bit of talk around the working group that developed this report and these scenarios. So we move from the working group phase into more of a peer support and networking group that will be starting. So Carmen, I don't know if you're heading this one up or if you can, she hasn't volunteered, no. But we will be continuing this work with a new climate risk group. So that will be taking the report, the work from it, and seeing how it is moves forward into the implementation stage. So after the webinar today, I cannot encourage you more to go download the report, read it in full, 80 pages. It's not too bad. It's some light afternoon reading for you. And yeah, get involved. So once the risk group is not officially set up yet, it's on the horizon. So we're getting to launch the report today. As soon as it is, it will be available for people to join through the ACTS member portal. So really encourage you to go and sign up to the member portal if you haven't done that in a while, or register to it. Or if you're not a member, now is the best time to join. This is just one of several groups that ACTS runs at the moment. We have others around other areas of focus, including best practice and reporting, circular economy, biodiversity. So every aspect of holistic campus sustainability. So that's my little plug there for ACTS. I will wrap up again with a massive thank you to our chairs. I'm sure you're very relieved, and I'm just only sad that you can't all go and get a drink together after this, because scattered all over the country. But thank you for your work. Thank you to the working group, everybody that participated in the workshops, everyone that supported this work, Andrew, everyone in New Zealand. It's been a massive undertaking for months, and yeah, really pleased to be able to bring it to you today. So let me stop sharing slides. We have some time for questions. So first up, unsurprisingly, we've had some questions come through around the selection of the temperatures that the scenarios were based on. Some of the questions that came through were discussed quite a lot in the group. So specifically around why 1.5 was selected and why we didn't go as extreme as over 4 degrees. So I think Aston's going to tackle this question to start with.
Just an easy question right off the bat, isn't it? Firstly, thank you to those who asked the question. So yeah, as I kind of alluded to earlier in the piece, there was a legislative requirement for some of our institutions to select the 1.5 degree, and that comes from the Australian government legislation. So for example, ANU, who has to report this year, is required to use a 1.5 degree scenario as part of its reporting. And I'm fairly certain that under New South Wales Treasury requirements, that is also the case as well. So we wanted to make sure that this was fit for purpose for those institutions that were required to actually report. It wasn't going to be any good if we did another scenario, and that meant that ANU couldn't actually use this work. And then it's a really good question about the other temperature, the 3.6. And there was a lot of discussion that happened in the working group. I'm sure many on the call can attest to that. Basically, we decided on the 3.6 degree because we felt it was a realistic extreme temperature for the timeframes that we were looking at. Easily, we could have chose 4.4 as a more extreme. It just happened to be that that was the collective decision of the group when we were talking it through. Yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Thanks, Aston. I will add something, is that we would have liked to have looked at a scenario that was more around a 2 degrees. But again, because of those constraints, we were only looking at two temperature pathways, and just reinforcing that those temperature pathways as well were where we're sort of looking at heading by what we considered was pathways that would head to those temperatures by the end of this century.
So just on the selection as well, were there any other vertical axes considered we've got the reactive and strategic of the Australian government? We probably could have added many layers of complexity here.
Yes, we looked at multiple. There was a lot of discussion in the working group around that. And it was a long time ago. It was back in October or something. So other working groups maybe are struggling to remember. But we chose Australia's approach, or the Australians sort of governance framework, and Australian governments, and not just the federal government, but also state governments' approaches, because we thought that would have a sort of dramatic influence on how universities operated. And so, yes, as you say, we could have chosen a lot of other other drivers, but you know, we had to pick something, and we thought that would have a significant impact.
Great, thank you. We've had a question around getting involved with the working group moving forward. So this pretty much concludes this working group. I think this was the output for the particular working group, but would any of our chairs like to talk about the aspirations for the group moving forward?
I kind of start, and then I'm sure others will have more to add, but as we've said at the presentation, this is just the very beginning. Now the hard work starts, and you know, whether you have to report or you are reporting voluntarily, we are all on the same boat here, and we can help each other through the process and learn from each other's learnings and errors and successes. So we were thinking, and all the working group members agreed to continue the group as a peer support group, where we can talk about what we are doing and get advice from others and give advice to others as well. So that's the group that we mentioned at the end, provisionally called Climate Risk Group. We'll see how if we give that name or change it, but it will be to support each other in those next steps of actually looking at the risks and opportunities for our own institutions.
Thanks, Carmen. Fantastic. We don't have too many more questions coming through, so I'll give a last call on questions if you have anything burning you want to ask from our chairs. In the meantime, I would just like to open it up to final comments from the chairs. And Siobhan, I don't know if you want to jump in as well as we wrap up this part of the journey and move into the next. What are you most looking forward to, perhaps, with working with these scenarios? It's an open question.
I can probably just add to what Carmen said in terms of an invitation for other universities to be part of the working group through ACTS. So I would just say, yeah, contact ACTS or RE. I'm putting you out there because, yeah, as Carmen said, we're all in the same boat. We might be in different boats in terms of our jurisdictions and whether the legislation applies to us right now, if it will in the future, but we're all trying to prepare our organisations and our community for this. So just, yeah, echo that, and that it's been a really fantastic, opportunity to learn from each other and share that resource. So we really welcome anybody else who's out there who's considering either joining ACTS or being a part of or being a part of the working group. So it's been an amazing piece of work that we have done together, but as Carmen said, it's just the beginning. So looking forward to rolling our sleeves up and getting our really getting our own stakeholders across this and really on board.
Yeah, I would second that last comment from Siobhan around internal stakeholders as well. I think that's going to be a really fascinating piece for me, and I think a lot of us in the working group it enables us to collaborate across our institution, not just with other sustainability professionals, which I'm really excited about as well, because it's such a multi-dimensional piece of work that is really required.
The other comment I would make, which doesn't really answer your question, Ree, but I think might be useful for tertiary education institutions, is that we did some voluntary reporting in 2024, and that involves setting up our governance structures and looking at our metrics and reporting. Sorry, our metrics and targets, which we already had sort of metrics and targets, but just doing sort of voluntary partial reporting, I think, has been really helpful to us, because it is, it does require some shifts and some consideration of how your university is or your institution is set up from a governance perspective. And so doing that voluntary disclosure has set us up much better for doing a full disclosure this year. So that's from a kind of and I think it will help us with embedding into our strategy and into our risk management. So yeah, if you know, I guess for organizations who have got mandatory reporting, I would encourage everybody to consider doing voluntary disclosure first up.
Thanks, Claire. We've had another question come through around, given that the global trends for emissions are to continue to increase, and that, you know, climate sensitivity may be higher than previously thought. Is the group already thinking towards plans for modelling impacts of higher temperature scenarios, so going above what we've already done?
Yeah, I don't see why not. I think that will be the next iteration in terms of the working group transitioning into more of that peer support group. I think Carmen said it really well before, in that this is just the start of the journey. So we'll have to continue to assess and evaluate these scenarios going forward. I don't know, Carmen or Claire, if you had any additional thoughts to that, but I think, yeah, it's definitely in the future, in my mind at least.
Yeah, and I would say these are very much narrative scenarios. So they're not quantitative scenarios, but there will be a need to look at more quantitative modelling, which is really, you know, they each have a slightly different role. And so I agree with what Aston has said, yeah, as well.
Just briefly to add to that, if we know something is that change is the only constant, and yes, things are continuously changing. Modeling and predictions are continually changing, and if we need to update the scenarios and think of, you know, different futures, then maybe that's something that, yeah, we can do in the future. It's definitely not a closed work or piece of, you know, a report or piece of work, but yeah, we've need to look at it in the future, perhaps, and update.
And to Ben's comment, which was more a comment than a question, but I hope the main conclusion for uni decision makers will be that we should do everything we can to lead us to getting our act together and to avoid the juggling for fire scenario. Yes, absolutely. I think that's what we're all working towards. Really, really important. Yeah. No, thank you for that comment.
I'm very conscious of time, but I think someone put in the chat, how do we access the report? So I'm gonna let you answer that.
What a good question. Yes, so everybody that's registered today, I will send an email around after the session. So you'll have access to this recording, as well as it's currently on the ACTS website, but you won't find it from the landing page just yet. We'll get that linked there just shortly, but you can always, I'll pop it in the chat in just a minute, or maybe Jess, who's can do it in there, so I'm not multitasking. But yeah, we're right on just about on the hour now, so I will have to begin by wrapping things up. So a final thank you again, everybody joining us in the audience today, for sending through your questions. I look forward to hearing your thoughts and feedback after you've read the report. Thanks again to our chairs and for Siobhan for joining us and sharing what's happening at Murdoch. A final plug, if you do want to get involved with this work, ACTS already does cover the majority of universities in Australia and New Zealand, although there are a few that aren't current members with us, and we'd love to have the entire sector engaging in this important work as we all try and tackle. And yeah, I really would love to think getting our act together, it makes you feel hopeful that we can turn this around, we can action this and really curb that exponential growth we're seeing in warming. So look at it and take some reassurance from it, as I have, and yeah, enjoy the report. We will wrap up there. Thank you, Jess. Jess has posted the link in the chat for me, and I will follow up with an email for that resource afterwards. So that's it for today. Thank you. We will see you at an ACTS event coming up again soon, no doubt, and enjoy the rest of your day.